Let me be direct with you before we go any single second further into this video. The Artemis II crew launched on April 7th, 2026, and right now, as you're watching this, they're either still in transit, completing their lunar flyby, or returning home. And the data coming back from that mission is already rewriting what we thought we knew about sending human beings beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in over 50 years. Not tweaking it, not adjusting it slightly, rewriting it. Because it turns out that a half-century of simulation, modeling, and animal studies could only get us so far. The actual human body, inside an actual spacecraft, crossing actual deep space, is doing things that surprise the scientists who spent years trying to predict exactly this. We have 10 of those things to talk about today. 10 specific challenges, 10 data stories, and 10 reasons why what we learned from Weisman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen is going to determine whether we can actually keep people alive on the lunar surface when Artemis III touches down. Let's get into it. Number 1 is the Van Allen belt radiation transit. And this is where we need to start because it sets the context for almost everything else. When Artemis II departed Earth and pushed through the Van Allen belts on its way to translunar space, every crew member was carrying personal radiation dosimeters alongside the spacecraft's own monitoring systems. The Van Allen belts are 2 zones of magnetically trapped charged particles surrounding Earth, and passing through them on the way to the Moon means exposure to a radiation environment that is fundamentally different from anything the International Space Station crew ever deals with. The ISS sits inside the protective magnetic bubble. Artemis II punched right through it. Before the mission, radiation modelers had constructed detailed predictions based on historical data from Apollo, from robotic probes, from the Orion capsule's own uncrewed Artemis Thorium flight, which flew a similar trajectory in 2022. Those models predicted dose rates with what the scientists considered acceptable confidence intervals. What the crew data is showing is that the actual dosimetry readings during the belt transit were not neatly centered on those predictions. The charged particle environment inside the capsule appears to be more variable than the models captured, partly because solar activity in 2026 is near a solar maximum cycle peak, and partly because the interaction between cosmic rays and the capsule's own shielding material creates secondary radiation products that are genuinely difficult to model from the outside. The total absorbed dose numbers are still being analyzed, but the variation in the dose rate moment to moment through the belts was higher than predicted. For Artemis III, this means the radiation shielding approach for lunar surface habitats needs to account for a more dynamic particle environment, not just an average one. Number 2 is something the medical team has been calling intracranial pressure dynamics, and this one gets uncomfortable to talk about because it directly challenges one of our most optimistic assumptions about how the human brain handles spaceflight. We have known for years that astronauts in microgravity experience a fluid shift toward the head. Without gravity pulling fluids down toward the legs, cerebrospinal fluid and blood redistribute upward, and this increases pressure inside the skull. On the ISS, this is documented. Some astronauts show measurable changes in the optic nerve, in the shape of the eyeball, and in visual acuity. It is called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, and it is one of the major unsolved problems in long-duration spaceflight medicine. The question nobody could fully answer before Artemis II was what happens to intracranial pressure when you go beyond low Earth orbit. Does the microgravity environment in deep space behave the same as in low orbit? Are there any additional factors unique to translunar space that affect fluid dynamics differently? The Artemis II crew is equipped with monitoring capability for this, and the preliminary data suggests that the pressure dynamics are not following the same pattern seen on ISS missions of comparable duration. Some crew members appear to be showing pressure changes at a faster timeline than ISS data would have predicted for the same elapsed mission duration. The working hypothesis involves the radiation environment potentially affecting the blood-brain barrier in ways that interact with the fluid redistribution, though this is still being studied. For Artemis III, astronauts spending days to weeks on the lunar surface in 1/6 gravity, not zero gravity, understanding how the brain responds to that partial gravity environment after a transit through deep space is now a priority research question that simply was not answerable before this mission. Number 3 is sleep architecture in deep space, and this one is fascinating from a neuroscience standpoint. The Artemis II crew is wearing monitoring equipment that tracks their sleep in detail, including sleep stage cycling, which tells researchers how much time is spent in light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep. On Earth, your sleep architecture is regulated by light cycles, temperature variation, social cues, and numerous environmental signals. In low Earth orbit on the ISS, the crew experiences roughly 16 sunrises and sunsets per day as the station orbits Earth, which creates its own disruption. But there are well-established protocols for managing that. In translunar space, the lighting situation is completely different. The spacecraft is not orbiting anything in a way that creates a regular light-dark cycle tied to the crew's position. The sun is a fixed, intense light source on one side. Earth recedes to a bright dot and then a smaller dot. The visual environment outside the spacecraft windows is fundamentally unlike anything the human brain evolved to process as a circadian signal. What the sleep data from Artemis II is showing is that sleep stage cycling is disrupted in ways that are more pronounced than pre-mission models predicted, particularly for REM sleep, which is the stage associated with emotional memory consolidation and cognitive restoration. The crew is sleeping, but the quality signature of that sleep looks different from what was expected. This matters enormously because on a lunar surface mission, if your crew arrives cognitively compromised from poor sleep quality during the transit, their ability to execute complex tasks under pressure is degraded from day one on the surface, before they even begin accumulating a new sleep debt. Number 4 brings us to something that the psychological community has been cautiously modeling, but openly admits is hard to predict, and that is the cognitive and emotional experience of seeing Earth shrink to a small object in space. This has a name in the literature. It is called the overview effect, and it was described by Apollo astronauts and later studied in ISS crew members who look out the cupola window and experience a profound shift in perspective about the planet and humanity, its place in the universe. But Artemis II is different from ISS in a critical way. From the ISS, Earth fills a huge portion of your field of view. You are close enough that you can see weather systems, coastlines, cities at night. The planet is enormous and present and immediate. From lunar distance, Earth is a small, bright, vulnerable-looking sphere in the blackness. The psychological literature predicted this would be significant. What it did not fully anticipate was how cognitively jarring the transition would be as the crew watched Earth shrink over the days of their transit. Crew psychological monitoring data and verbal reports being analyzed by the mission psychology team indicate that the emotional intensity of actually witnessing Earth become a small object is categorically different from any simulation or training scenario. Virtual reality training had the astronauts experience a visual approximation of the view. Looking out the actual window of Orion at the actual Earth from actual lunar distance appears to activate a cognitive response that the simulations did not capture. Some crew members have described the experience in debriefs using language that suggests it crossed a threshold from intellectual understanding into visceral, overwhelming reality in a way that no amount of preparation fully addressed. For mission planners, this creates a question about how much psychological support and processing time crew members need during and after a deep space mission, and whether current mental health monitoring protocols are calibrated to detect the right kinds of stress indicators for this specific experience. Number 5 is carbon dioxide management inside Orion. And this is operational rather than physiological at its root, but the physiological consequences are significant. The Orion capsule is smaller than the International Space Station. It is a capsule designed for transit, not for extended habitation, though Artemis II extends the operational envelope considerably. Carbon dioxide buildup in small enclosed spaces is a well-documented challenge in spacecraft, and the ISS had a famous incident years ago, where elevated carbon dioxide levels were causing crew headaches and cognitive impairment before the problem was fully characterized. The Artemis II mission is generating real-time data about how effectively the Orion environmental control systems manage carbon dioxide. Removal for a 4-person crew over an extended mission duration in this specific capsule volume. Pre-mission models had calibrated the system based on component testing and short-duration crewed missions. The actual metabolic output of 4 astronauts under the specific stress conditions of a deep space mission, including elevated cortisol, interrupted sleep, and the physical demands of the mission, appears to generate slightly higher carbon dioxide loads than the baseline models assumed. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide inside the cabin has been tracked closely, and there have been periods where the crew has needed to manage their activity levels to help the environmental control system maintain acceptable levels. For Artemis III, which will include a lunar surface habitat with different environmental parameters, this real-world metabolic data from Artemis II is critical input for habitat life support design. Number 6 is muscle and bone adaptation in the context of the mission's specific gravity profile, and this is where the partial gravity of the lunar surface becomes scientifically interesting in a new way. We have extensive data on what zero gravity does to muscles and bones over time. Astronauts on the ISS lose bone density and muscle mass at documented rates and follow countermeasure exercise protocols designed to slow that loss. What we do not have extensive data on is the transition profile from zero gravity to 1/6 gravity and how the musculoskeletal system responds to that specific change after a deep space transit. The Artemis II crew is not landing on the moon, but they are the closest we have come to approximating the physiological state of an astronaut arriving at the moon since Apollo. The crew's physical condition data during and after their mission, including markers of muscle protein synthesis, bone resorption indicators in urine and blood samples, and postural stability measurements, will give the most direct physiological insight into what an Artemis III astronaut will feel like when they step onto the lunar surface. Pre-mission models based on ISS data predicted certain degradation curves. The Artemis II data on this appears consistent with those models in some areas, but shows faster degradation in specific muscle groups than expected, likely related to the confined movement space inside Orion compared to the ISS. For a crew that needs to operate in spacesuits on a lunar surface immediately after landing, the physical condition they arrive in has direct operational consequences. Number 7 is the vestibular system response in deep space, which is the body's balance and spatial orientation system, and this one was expected to be challenging, but has proven to be more persistently disorienting than the models fully captured. Space motion sickness is well understood in the early days of a mission. The inner ear and visual system conflict produces nausea and disorientation as the brain recalibrates to weightlessness. What is less understood is the sustained vestibular adaptation pattern in deep space specifically. On the ISS, astronauts adapt to microgravity within days and are largely functional for the remainder of their stay. The Orion vehicle has different motion characteristics than the station. The capsule can experience more pronounced attitude control thruster firings, which create brief and unpredictable accelerations. The spacecraft's orientation relative to the Sun changes in ways that affect thermal management, meaning the visual reference frame outside the windows changes in ways that have no analogs in orbital spaceflight. The vestibular monitoring data from the Artemis II crew indicates that some crew members experienced prolonged periods of spatial disorientation that persisted beyond what ISS adaptation timelines would predict. This is significant for Artemis III, because a disoriented crew member in a spacesuit on the lunar surface faces risks that are categorically more dangerous than a disoriented crew member inside a safe habitat. Number 8 involves the immune system, and this is an area of intense scientific interest that has been building for years in spaceflight medicine. The immune system in microgravity behaves differently than it does on Earth. Latent viruses that sit dormant in the body, including members of the herpes virus family that most humans carry, can reactivate in space. Immune cell function changes. The inflammatory response profile of astronauts in space is measurably different from their ground baseline. What makes Artemis II scientifically important for immunology is the radiation environment. In low Earth orbit, radiation levels are elevated compared to Earth, but still partially shielded by the magnetic field. In translunar space, the crew is exposed to the full galactic cosmic ray flux, plus any solar particle events that occur during their mission. Galactic cosmic rays, the high-energy particles that stream in from outside the solar system, can damage DNA directly and can also affect immune cell populations in ways that are not fully characterized from human data. The Artemis II immunological samples being collected, including blood draws at multiple mission time points, will provide the first direct human data on immune function during exposure to a deep space radiation environment. Pre-mission models predicted certain changes in immune cell counts and function. The early indications suggest that the immune response to the deep space environment may be more pronounced than the predictions from low Earth orbit extrapolation suggested, which has direct implications for how we think about infection risk during a lunar surface stay. Number 9 takes us into the thermal regulation challenge, which is both a spacecraft systems issue and a physiological one for the crew. The thermal environment of translunar space is extreme in a way that Earth orbit does not fully replicate. In low Earth orbit, the spacecraft alternates between the intense heat of direct sunlight and the cold of Earth's shadow roughly every 90 minutes as it orbits. This creates a thermal cycling pattern that engineers understand well. In translunar space, the thermal environment is more constant in some ways, but more intense in others. The Orion capsule executes what is called a passive thermal control rotation, essentially a slow roll to distribute solar heating evenly around the capsule's exterior. The crew inside is in a vehicle that is managing an enormous temperature differential between the sun-facing side and the shadow side, and the environmental control systems are working to maintain a habitable interior temperature. The challenge revealed by mission data is that the crew's own thermal comfort has been more variable than predicted. Individual crew members are reporting temperature perception differences that correlate with their position in the capsule relative to the vehicle's orientation. More significantly, the physiological data shows that some crew members have experienced thermal regulation stress, where the body is working harder than expected to maintain core temperature, which consumes metabolic resources that would otherwise be available for cognitive and physical performance. For Artemis III surface operations, the thermal environment in a lunar spacesuit on the surface combines direct solar radiation, reflected radiation from the lunar regolith, and the radiative cold of shadow with no atmospheric buffer whatsoever. This Artemis II's thermal data is informing the next iteration of surface suit design requirements. Number 10 is the one that ties everything together, and it is the aggregate effect of all the previous 9 challenges operating simultaneously on the same 4 human beings. This is sometimes called operational cognitive load in the space medicine literature, but that phrase does not quite capture what is actually happening. What the Artemis II data is revealing is that the interaction between sleep disruption, radiation exposure, intracranial pressure changes, vestibular disorientation, immune activation, thermal stress, carbon dioxide fluctuation, And the profound psychological experience of deep space does not simply add up arithmetically. The combination of these stressors produces effects on crew performance and decision-making that are not predicted by modeling each stressor in isolation and summing the results. This is not a surprise to the scientists who have been warning about it for years, but it is one thing to model it theoretically, and another thing to measure it in 4 real human beings on a real mission. The cognitive performance data from the Artemis II crew, assessed through standardized task batteries that the crew completes at regular intervals throughout the mission, is showing degradation patterns in certain cognitive domains, particularly working memory and complex decision-making under time pressure, that exceed the predictions from additive models. The compounding effect is real, and it is larger than expected. For Artemis III, where the crew will not just be transiting, but will be living and working on the lunar surface, and executing technically demanding tasks in spacesuits with real consequences if they make errors, this finding may be the single most important outcome of the entire Artemis II mission, because it means that the threshold of acceptable crew condition before surface operations begin needs to be reassessed, and the mission architecture for surface stays needs to build in more recovery time, more redundant safety checks, and more conservative abort criteria than current planning assumed. Now let us talk about what all of this means. Because taken together, these 10 findings paint a picture of human deep space exploration that is more complex and more humbling than the optimistic projections that often dominate the public conversation about going back to the moon and onto Mars. The Apollo program, extraordinary as it was, did not have the monitoring technology to measure most of what we are measuring on Artemis II. The astronauts of the 1960s and early 1970s came back and reported how they felt, and we learned an enormous amount from that. But between feeling and measuring is a vast scientific distance, and Artemis II is crossing that distance. Every data point from Reed Weisman's radiation dosimeter, every sleep stage recording from Victor Glover's wrist monitor, every cognitive performance test score from Christina Cook's daily assessment, every immunological marker from Jeremy Hansen's blood samples is going into a data set that will directly inform whether the human body can sustain a meaningful working presence on the lunar surface. What is particularly striking about the Artemis II findings is that they validate the general categories of concern that space medicine researchers have been raising, but they challenge the specific magnitudes and timelines of those concerns. It is one thing to know that radiation is a risk. It is another to have your dosimetry data come back, showing more variability than your shielding model predicted. It is one thing to know that cognitive performance degrades under multi-stressor conditions. It is another to see the working memory scores from day 8 of the mission, and realize that your model underestimated the compounding effect by a factor that matters for operational safety planning. The implications for Artemis III are specific and actionable. The mission planners now have real data to work with instead of modeled estimates for several critical parameters. The radiation transit data will drive updates to shielding specifications for the human landing system and any surface habitats. The intracranial pressure findings will affect medical monitoring requirements and potentially influence crew selection criteria for surface missions, since individual variation in susceptibility to fluid shift appears to be significant. The sleep and cognitive data will affect mission timeline design, including how much rest time is built into the schedule before high-risk surface activities begin. The immune activation findings will affect medical kit composition and the criteria for delaying or aborting surface operations due to crew health status. The thermal regulation data will feed into the next generation of spacesuit design and the protocols for managing crew body temperature during extravehicular activities in the lunar thermal environment. There's also a larger message here about the relationship between simulation and reality in human spaceflight. The amount of preparation that went into Artemis II was extraordinary. Years of training, thousands of hours of simulation, extensive pre-mission medical characterization of each crew member, detailed modeling of every system and every physiological parameter. And despite all of that, the actual mission produced surprises. Not catastrophic surprises, but meaningful scientific surprises that the simulations did not capture. This is not a criticism of the preparation. It is a statement about the fundamental complexity of the human body in an environment it did not evolve to inhabit. No simulation can fully reproduce the experience of being a biological organism 400,000 kilometers from Earth, surrounded by hard vacuum, bombarded by galactic cosmic rays, looking out a small window at a planet that has become a small blue dot. The Apollo astronauts, who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972, were extraordinary human beings, operating in conditions of extraordinary risk with remarkable technological achievement. What Artemis II is adding to that legacy is measurement. Detailed, systematic, physiologically rich measurement of what actually happens to human beings when they go to the moon. And that measurement is the foundation on which a sustainable human presence beyond Earth orbit must be built. Because, unlike Apollo, the goal of the Artemis program is not to go to the moon and come back. The goal is to go to the moon and stay, to build the expertise and infrastructure for eventually going to Mars. And Mars makes the moon look nearby. A Mars mission involves months of deep space transit in each direction, years away from Earth, and a radiation environment that makes the translunar doses of Artemis II look modest in comparison. Every lesson we learned from Artemis II about radiation variability, about the compounding of physiological stressors, about the limits of simulation in preparing the human brain for the psychological reality of deep space, is a lesson that has to be learned before we can seriously talk about Mars. We cannot afford to discover these things for the first time when we are 6 months out and there is no turning back. The data coming back from the 4 members of the Artemis II crew is not just valuable for NASA. It is being shared through international scientific channels with the European Space Agency, with the Canadian Space Agency, with the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, all of which are partners in the Artemis program. It will form the basis of scientific papers that will take years to fully analyze and publish. It will influence the design of the Lunar Gateway space station that is planned as a waypoint for future Moon and Mars missions. It is, in the deepest scientific sense, foundational data. The kind of data you only get once from the first mission that actually does the thing, and that remains relevant for decades. So the next time you hear someone describe the return to the moon as a repeat of Apollo or question why we're doing it again, remember these 10 things. Remember that we are measuring the human experience of deep space in a way that has never been done before. Remember that the Van Allen belt is not just a physics concept, but a lived biological event for 4 people who passed through it. Remember that the overview effect is not just a philosophical phenomenon, but a measurable cognitive event with implications for mission planning. Remember that the immune system, the vestibular system, the sleeping brain, and the cardiovascular system are all doing specific and measurable things right now that they have never been directly measured doing before. And remember that the scientists back on Earth who spent years building the models are now getting to find out which ones were right, which ones were off, and what questions they need to ask next. That is what Artemis II is. It is not just a mission. It is a question to the universe about whether human beings can truly live in deep space. And the answer is coming back right now, in numbers on a screen, in blood samples waiting to be analyzed, in the words of 4 astronauts describing what it actually felt like to be there. The answer is not simple. It is not perfectly reassuring, but it is real, and real is exactly what we needed. If you want to stay updated as more Artemis II data becomes public over the coming months, make sure you are subscribed because we are going to be covering every major finding as it drops. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about. Leave a comment telling me which of these 10 challenges you think is the most serious obstacle to a permanent lunar presence. And check out our video on the Artemis III mission profile if you want to understand exactly what the next crew is going to have to do with everything we are learning right now.